Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to do something very different. You see, Total War Warhammer 1 is almost 9 years old and a lot has changed since that series has kicked off. Lots and lots of content have been added in, the races themselves have changed dramatically, including the Game 1 races. So what I want to do in this video is go back to Warhammer 1 and show off the races and how they worked back in the day before they started becoming more of their fleshed out versions. Because back in Warhammer 1, sure, this was a fantasy game, and it was already quite detached from Total War as it was still more in line with the typical Total War games than it is nowadays. And considering that this game franchise actually hit its maximum popularity around the end of Warhammer 2 to the start of Warhammer 3, there's a lot of people who might have not gone back to Warhammer 1, and for good reason, not gonna lie. So yeah, let's talk about this. But before anything, a big thank you to our sponsor, Instant Gaming. Instant Gaming is a platform where you'll be able to buy loads of different games at discounted rates, even ones that haven't released just yet. Gaming is getting more expensive and it looks like it might get more expensive when GTA 6 eventually releases, apparently if you've heard all the rumors. So it's always good to get a very nice discount. Not only that, but if you're a person like me, which I imagine so if you're watching this channel and you do Warhammer Tabletop, yeah, you're going to want your money going onto more minis, especially with the Grand Cafe reveal. We also have a giveaway going on. Win a game of your choice. All you have to do is click on the link in the description below, sign up. You don't even have to make a purchase. But, yep, you can win whatever title you're looking at recently. I'm about to go and buy Atomfall. I've heard pretty good things about it. And who hasn't won a game based on post-apocalypse Britain, right? It sounds cool. This is a company that I myself buy games from, so it's always really nice to work with a company that I use their services. A big thank you once again to Instant Gaming for the sponsorship, and now let's return to our regularly scheduled programming. So let's start off with how it used to work for start positions. If some races were linked as just like, say for example, the Empire, all the start positions would be the exact same location, meaning that for the Empire, Karl Franz, Gelt, and Volkmar were all in the same spot. Later on, DLC factions would start getting their own stylized start positions, like for example, Belagar with the whole Clan Angrid faction. But replayability was definitely a lot less when it came to Warhammer 1. Not that this game lasted that long, because it only was active for about a year and a half before we jumped into Warhammer 2. So it already starts to show evolution from the very beginning. Not only that, but the typical faction selection was more old school Total War. So yeah, you were pretty much very limited back in the day. It's really weird to see it like this when we've got it in Warhammer 3 where there's so many different factions to play around with. Hell, even the Warriors of Chaos were just all three of them in the same location. I don't think you could actually co-op Warriors of Chaos. I can't really remember that far back. You could co-op Vampires, and that's mostly because you had two different sections. Modding did become a bit of a necessity for Warhammer 3. I think it's a lot because of the quality of life stuff and the fact that everything was moving fairly quick, but more in the sense of releases. DLCs back then were super quickly released. Alongside that, races used to have their racial leader with an introductory quest battle that you could pick up, and that meant that you could actually learn how to do combat. The map itself is still very similar. The art and lighting is probably a little bit better when it came to Warhammer 1. The lighting in Warhammer 3 is a bit too bright for my liking, in all honesty, but in most cases the map hasn't evolved too much. Sure, some settlements have been moved around, some stuff have been added. Obviously keep in mind that with Mortal Empires in Warhammer 2 stuff were changed around, and then for Immortal Empires even more so, but it's more or less the same. Honestly, they had a very good format there. Everything does feel a little bit bigger when it comes to Warhammer 1. I think it's because the map was so centralized and movement in general for armies was a lot less. So in some cases you weren't going on to the next settlement on turn 2. This is something that would slow down your campaign a little bit. Game 1's map was pretty much just the old world itself. So the Empire, a little bit of the Badlands, a lot of the Kara's Anchor, just not going down to the southern Badlands itself. Norsca, Bretonnia, the Southern Realms, which has changed quite a bit, especially during Warhammer 3, and the little slither, very little slither of the Northern Chaos Waste, where you'd start with the Warriors of Chaos. Honestly, I'm really surprised when looking through this that we got the games moving so quickly, mostly because there's still a lot more that they could have done with Game 1, but I guess they wanted to push on forward because Warhammer 1 sold, but they knew that Warhammer 2 was going to sell even better because Skaven, Lizardmen, High Elves, Dark Elves, that's where things were going to get a little bit more high fantasy, as Warhammer 1 was a bit more reserved given the races that they had the options of. Alright, so let's talk about the Empire. The vanilla faction, they played very similar to that of a normal historical faction, with their only mechanic was officers back in the day. Sure, you had wizards and stuff like that, but there was nothing really to set them apart from other factions. The tech tree is kind of similar still, and most of the cases it's just added onto it, but you can see the stark difference when you start looking towards Karl Franz, for example. You don't have prestige, you don't have anything. The Empire had a massive rework in Warhammer 2 during the Hunt and the Beast, and then obviously did have some changes during Warhammer 3 during Thrones of Decay, but here, they were as vanilla can be. Dwarves, pretty much the same thing. There was one minor mechanic per race and that's it. Dwarves just had the Grudge system, which was finally changed up when it came to Thrones of Decay, I believe, but other than that, yep, nothing really special. Their roster mostly focused on gunpowder and heavy infantry, but very slow moving stuff at that. There was nothing really to say what's the difference between this and that. And even then, with Warhammer 1, a lot of people did notice the differences in terms of gameplay, because obviously the races are quite different in terms of like units, but you were playing kind of the same campaign over and over and over again. Bretonnia was released completely for free, and they're kind of still the same. I mean, obviously they've had some changes, an increased tech tree, they've had a bit of a rework, 2 reworks actually, and even then they still kind of feel like the Warhammer 1 variant. It's weird to see this, but yeah, I'm kind of nostalgic. They were a race that only their mechanic was focused around chivalry, which allowed you to get the Green Knight, and even then that was limited on how many chances you had of the Green Knights popping up, but still they were fairly popular. I'm actually pretty surprised that they released them for free, to be honest. I feel like if they were a bit of a paid DLC, they would have been more incentivized to fix them up when it came to Warhammer 2, or even in the rework for Warhammer 3. Here's hoping that there's still a chance that they'll get another touch-up. A third and final rework. Wouldn't that be nice? Here's a fun one, Wood Elves. So they got a rework in Warhammer 2, and I think a lot of people forgot how bad the Wood Elves used to be. So they had officers in the same vein as Karl Franz, so they had a reused mechanic, and they still have this, by the way. But the big thing that the Wood Elves had, which everyone pretty much universally hated, was Amber. Amber was a resource that you would use to recruit certain units, to also get certain buildings. It was such a slog. Now, it wasn't too much of a problem when you were dealing with Amber in the Warhammer 1 map, mostly because it was much smaller, more compact, and your campaigns weren't going to be that long. However, in Warhammer 2, things got so bad that I don't think anyone was even touching the Wood Elves unless they were trying to pick up the achievement, until we finally got the DLC, the Twisted and the Twilights, because that completely fixed them up and actually made the Wood Elves a faction that, yeah, people can play and have a lot of fun with. You're still not doing as much as everyone else. You're mostly centralized to Athelloran, but it's definitely better than it was here. Greenskins, again, not much going on. Their tech tree was pretty atrocious. Their buildings were decent, I guess. Everything was just kind of centralized to one location. All the goblins and orcs were pretty much found in just like 2 or 3 buildings, and that's pretty much it. But what really set them apart, and I'm not saying that in a positive way, was fightiness. You would build up your bar, it would spawn a war army. The army you would not be able to control, so it was just kind of following you all the time, but sometimes it would get you into situations where you were dragged into wars that you didn't want to be in, or it would just completely destroy itself before you found any use for it. It's wild to see that. Obviously, it did get a very nice touch-up where we got Grom released, and then a few minor changes for Warhammer 3, but yeah, greenskins were not fun. Vampire counts. Admittedly, vampire counts haven't really changed much. They had a minor rework in Warhammer 2, but they're still pretty much playing the same. The funny thing is they had some of the worst auto-resolve in the game back in the day, and yeah, nothing here. There's not really much I can say here. Hopefully one day we'll actually see a fabled proper vampire count DLC and rework, but until then, vampire count fans, I hope you're doing okay. Just wait, be patient. Warriors of Chaos, this is a big one. If you're just joining in from like Warhammer 3, you would not have seen how the Warriors of Chaos were before. So they were a horde faction, and not a fun type of horde faction. You'd have to go down, you'd have to have a lot of movement. Hell, the first turn was practically always wasted, by the way, and you would start uniting the different tribes, essentially in a similar way to now, but you wouldn't have a Dark Fortress. You'd be getting those tribes for the Norscan sub-factions themselves, and you would be building up with a pretty bad tech tree, a very limited roster. You don't have all the fancy units and stuff. which was pretty annoying. And your campaign mostly centered around, in most cases, 1 or 2 armies rather than having multiple armies. There was no world conquest here. It was literally destroying as much as possible. And there was an endgame crisis, which, you know, would spawn against you. There was an endgame general for everyone, actually, which was quite nice. It was the Chaos Invasion. It was basically the end times, which, by the way, by the story of this franchise, Warhammer 1 is the end game. It goes game 3, game 2, game 1. Beastmen, yeah, so this one, you started with 2 armies. It was at least a little bit better than the Warriors of Chaos. But the Beastmen were so weak that you spent most of your time hiding in your horde, because yes, another horde faction, there were no Herdstones back then. They were one of the more frustrating factions to play around, low leadership, not a lot of buffs, they were missing so much. Thankfully, the Silence and the Fury fixed them up quite dramatically, because even their tech tree was so bad, there was really no reason to play with the Beastmen, other than just once to get the achievement, and even then I think a lot of people skipped out on Warhammer 2 until they got the rework. And then lastly, Norsca, who very much play the same way. Yeah, they got an increased tech tree and a few quality of life changes, but most of Norsca plays the same exact way. There is something very important to note here though, so a lot of people might not remember this, but Norsca could not properly colonize the other regions in the old world. You had Norsca, you could take capitals, you could take port settlements, but you couldn't take the others. That's something that was a very weird design choice back in the day that got changed up for Warhammer 2, I believe. But even then, it's just a slog, and it's something that was a design choice in Warhammer 1 general for some stuff. The Orcs and the Greenskins, for example, could only originally, that was quickly changed, by the way, after a lot of screaming, take settlements that were in the Badlands and in the Kara's Anchor. The Empire, Bretonnia, and the Vampire Clans could only take settlements in the actual normal settlement areas, so the Old World, Bretonnia, and stuff like that. They would have to raise the other settlements. But yeah, as you can see, a lot of the races have changed quite dramatically over the 9 years of this franchise, and I imagine it's going to continue changing. There's a bunch of reworks that we are hoping to see. I still think there's a fair amount of DLC to come. It's just a little trip down memory lane, because I was talking about Warhammer 1, interestingly enough, a few days ago, and I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a retrospective. Have a great day, everyone. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Once again, check out the link in the description for the giveaway, and I'll see you all again very, very soon. I'm off to paint some Bretonnians, because I have a lot of Bretonnians to paint. Oh my god, do I have a lot of Bretonnians to paint.